Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind political and cultural discourse. We are Sarah and Mark. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the book The Invisible Power of Argentina, How Culture, Education, and Global Affection Became the Country's Greatest Strategic Assets by Matthias Verne. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember that you can find the link to buy the book in the description.
I am really, really excited to get into this one today.
It's such a fascinating read because if you think about it, imagine you're just scrolling through your morning news feed, right?
Right.
And in one headline, you read about this nation that is just grappling with triple-digit inflation.
Yeah, totally plunging
That's
currency.
massive institutional protests. And the analysis is always so dire. Economists are just throwing their hands up.
It paints this picture of total perpetual crisis.
Right. But then, you switch over to your social media feed, and suddenly the entire globe seems to be wearing this exact same country's sky blue and white sports jerseys.
Yeah, the World Cup jerseys are everywhere.
Everywhere. And you see, like, Hollywood actors traveling thousands of miles just to eat at their local steakhouses.
Oh, the asado culture.
Right. And then you have hundreds of thousands of international students who are actively choosing to pack up and move there for their university education.
It's a massive influx.
So the cognitive dissonance for you as an observer is just staggering.
It really is.
How can a nation that is so frequently characterized by severe economic volatility, I mean, real punishing volatility projects, such an outsized magnetic cultural influence across the planet?
And that dissonance is really the central mystery of the text we're analyzing in this deep dive.
It's the core question.
Yeah, because the global press, they give us the crisis narrative, but the global public demonstrates this almost, irrational affection for the country's cultural output.
Right, irrational is a good word for it.
And Matthias Verne's book, it attempts to deconstruct that exact friction.
So what is his main argument then?
Well, he's looking at how cultural capital and educational prestige function as these massive geopolitical multipliers.
Okay, multipliers.
Right, but the core thesis really hinges on a very pragmatic reality, and that is that those multipliers, they absolutely require the sturdy foundation of reliable institutions.
To actually work, you mean?
Exactly, to translate into tangible, real-world advantages.
Right.
Because if the institutional bedrock is fractured, then that immense cultural influence, it just gets trapped.
Has nowhere to go.
Yeah, it remains this beautiful aesthetic, rather than an actionable diplomatic or economic strategy.
Which brings up the cover art of the book. I mean, it actually visualizes this trapped aesthetic perfectly.
Oh, the cover is brilliant.
It is. It's a brilliant piece of semiotics. Because you have this dark, almost velvet-looking starry backdrop, right?
Yeah.
And floating right in the center is the golden FIFA World Cup trophy, and it's completely illuminated.
Just glowing.
Right. And circling the trophy are the dark silhouettes of tango dancers locked in this passionate embrace.
Very classic romantic imagery.
Exactly. And below that, you have a stack of these ancient leather-bound books and a golden quill.
Which clearly points to the massive literary tradition. Right?
Yeah, the legacy of Jorge Luis Borges and Julio Cortázar.
Right, the intellectual heavyweights.
And then off to the right, there's a glowing golden map of the Malvinas Islands.
So all these elements of profound national pride and soft power.
Exactly. But then, and this is the crazy part, positioned right on the left side, violently slicing into all this beautiful imagery, is a literal chainsaw.
It's so jarring.
It is incredibly jarring to look at.
But the chainsaw shatters the romance deliberately.
Right.
I mean, it's the visual representation of the institutional shocks,
Economic cuts.
The cuts, the severe internal volatility that defines the nation's domestic reality.
It's the perfect metaphor.
It is. By placing the chainsaw immediately adjacent to the World Cup and the literature, the author is kind of forcing the reader to acknowledge that Argentina's soft power does not exist in a vacuum.
Right. It's not some sanitized thing.
Exactly. The world's affection for the tango and the sports triumphs, it's constantly rubbing up against the friction of its political and economic instability.
So to understand how the chainsaw and the World Cup are operating in the same geopolitical arena, we really have to establish the mechanics of soft power, right?
Yeah, we have to define our terms.
Because this term gets thrown around a lot in media. People just use it as a synonym for cultural exports.
Which is an oversimplification.
Completely. Joseph Nye's original definition from the late 1980s is much more precise.
Right. He defined it as the ability of a state to attract and co-opt rather than coerce.
Exactly. Because hard power is the coercion.
Right. The military deployments, the economic sanctions.
Yeah, the leverage that physically forces another nation to do what you want against their will.
We also need to distinguish soft power from sharp power, though.
Oh, that's a good point. Sharp power is a newer concept, right?
Yeah, it's a newer term used by international relations scholars to describe the manipulation of information.
Like disinformation campaigns.
Exactly. Sharp power involves covertly undermining a foreign society from within, usually by subverting democratic processes or spreading fake news.
Right, so it's aggressive but hidden.
Yes, but soft power relies entirely on the mechanism of consent.
Consent is the key word there.
It is. It's built on the stories a nation tells about itself, the universality of its values and the appeal of its way of life.
Right.
When a country successfully wields soft power, foreign publics and foreign governments actually want to align with it.
They feel this organic affinity toward it.
Exactly. However, cultivating that affinity is really only step one.
Right, because Verne introduces this crucial conceptual model in the book, the soft power conversion chain.
Yes, the conversion chain is so important.
Because it addresses the fundamental problem. How does liking a country's culture actually help that country strategically?
Right, where does the rubber actually meet the road?
Exactly. So the chain starts with cultural capital, your music, your sports, your literature.
And that capital generates attraction.
Right. Like, if you are listening to this deep dive right now and thinking about a country you'd love to visit purely because of its food or its cinema, you are experiencing that attraction.
You're in the first link of the chain.
Exactly.
Right.
But attraction must then build legitimacy.
Right. The foreign public has to begin to view the exporting nation as credible.
Or sophisticated, or morally sound.
Yeah. And then the final, and honestly the most difficult link in the chain, is converting that legitimacy into tangible benefits.
The actual geopolitical payoff.
Right. Securing favorable diplomatic alliances, attracting foreign direct investment,
Boosting high-value tourism.
or establishing international cooperative research agreements.
But that breakdown of that final link is the defining characteristic of the Argentine paradox, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, Buenos Aires has historically been referred to as the Paris of South America.
Right, because of its rich cosmopolitan heritage and monumental architecture.
So the cultural attraction is undeniable. The legitimacy in realms of art and sociology is incredibly robust.
But the conversion chain just stalls at the very end.
It hits a wall. The global admiration for the culture exists simultaneously with this profound skepticism regarding the nation's economic predictability and legal frameworks.
If you think about it in everyday terms, it is like walking down a main street and seeing the most brilliantly designed storefront for a restaurant.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Right. The aesthetic is just flawless. The smells drifting out of the kitchen, the culture, the music, the ambiance, it's totally intoxicating.
It pulls you right in.
Exactly. And the window displays all these reviews highlighting decades of historical prestige. So naturally, there's a line around the block. You are drawn in.
You want to be part of it.
Yeah. But the moment you actually walk through the doors and look into the kitchen, it is total chaos.
Total chaos.
The service is unpredictable, the management is arguing loudly in the back, and the prices on the menu are literally changing while you are eating your appetizer.
Because of the inflation.
Right. So as a customer, you will absolutely take a photo of the beautiful dining room for your social media.
You'll enjoy the specific meal.
Exactly. But if you are a supplier or an investor looking to franchise that restaurant, you are going to walk away.
We'll have to. The chaotic kitchen makes you entirely unwilling to sign a 10-year contract.
You just wouldn't risk it.
And that storefront analogy perfectly captures the dichotomy between the cultural consumer and the international stakeholder.
Right, because they have totally different motivations.
Exactly. The global public consumes Argentine exports with visceral passion. They're moved by the melancholic history of the tango, they savor Malbec wine, and they dissect Borges' literature.
They love the experience.
But a foreign diplomat negotiating a trade agreement or a multinational corporation considering a massive infrastructure investment, they operate with a completely different set of metrics.
They don't care how good the wine is if the contract isn't secure.
Exactly. Their affection for the culture is immediately superseded by the pragmatic realities of sudden policy reversals.
Sifting legal frameworks.
And currency controls. The cultural storefront brings them to the table, but the institutional kitchen prevents the deal from closing.
It's such a structural trap. But the fascinating part of Verne's analysis, I think, is what exactly makes up that storefront.
Yeah, the components of the attraction.
Right, because it isn't just highbrow literature and opera keeping people in line outside the restaurant.
Not at all.
The magnetic pull of Argentina is heavily reliant on the visceral, everyday, lived experiences of its people. We have to look at how everyday culture functions as a geopolitical tool.
And you really cannot examine the lived experience of Argentina without doing a deep sociological dive into football.
Absolutely not. It's foundational.
The book dedicates a substantial portion to the 2022 World Cup and the figure of Lionel Messi. But Verne is careful not to treat this merely as a sporting victory. He analyzes football as an overarching, nonpartisan narrative.
Which is vital in a country that is historically fractured by deep ideological fault lines.
Right, economic and political divides are huge there. But the national team became a unifying symbol, a rare moment of absolute internal cohesion.
And the global broadcast of that final match was inescapable. But the soft power generated wasn't just about athletic dominance, was it?
No, it was about the narrative arc.
Right. Messi and the team functioned as global symbols of resilience.
They represented a triumph over relentless adversity.
Which, when you think about it, closely mirrors the psychological struggles of the nation itself.
Exactly. Consider Messi's personal story, the relentless pursuit of a singular goal, enduring agonizing heartbreak after heartbreak on the international stage for over a decade.
The lost finals, the criticism.
Yeah. Combined with this very specific, humble artistry on the pitch, that narrative taps into universal human values.
It's not just about a game anymore.
No, it wasn't merely that Argentina won a trophy. It was that the global public felt a deep emotional catharsis watching them win.
Right. I mean, millions of people in Bangladesh, in India, the Middle East.
Places with no geographic or economic connection to South America.
Exactly. They poured into the streets to celebrate. That is a massive, instantaneous injection of soft power.
The diplomatic utility of that moment is just profound. It projected a narrative of the country not as an economically struggling state at the bottom of the globe, but as a vibrant, passionate, and ultimately victorious cultural force.
It allowed the state to communicate through the universal language of sport,
bypassing all the traditional political skepticism.
But the author emphasizes that relying solely on massive, episodic events like a World Cup is insufficient for long-term strategy, right?
Yeah, you can't win a World Cup every year.
Right. So the true emotional layer of Argentina's soft power is embedded in these quiet, daily, intimate rituals.
And the two rituals the book singles out are the asado and the sharing of meat.
Right. For anyone unfamiliar, asado is often translated simply as a barbecue.
But the text makes it clear that reducing it to grilling meat completely misses the sociological function.
Completely. And then mate is this highly caffeinated herbal infusion, traditionally drunk from a hollowed-out gourd through a metal straw called a bombilla.
Right.
And it is passed from hand to hand in a circle.
The mechanics of these rituals are engineered to build trust.
How so?
Well, think about the physical act of sharing mate. A group of people is literally drinking from the exact same vessel, sharing the same straw.
It's incredibly intimate.
It inherently strips away hierarchy. It forces an intimate, egalitarian dynamic.
Right. Doesn't matter if you're the boss or the intern, you're in the circle.
Exactly. And the asado functions similarly, but through the manipulation of time.
Right, because it takes forever to cook.
Exactly. It is not about fast consumption. It requires hours of slow wood burning, forcing the participants to converse, to argue, and to connect long before any food is actually consumed.
So when a foreign envoy or a visiting academic or an international business leader partakes in these rituals,
it generates a level of human connection that sitting across a boardroom table in Geneva simply cannot replicate.
it's a completely different dynamic.
It creates a micro-level diplomatic bond based on hospitality and inclusion.
And the sensory landscape of these rituals is incredibly potent. I mean, the smoke of the asado wood drifting over a neighborhood,
The deafening, almost tribal roar of La Bombonera Stadium.
or the melancholic notes of a bandoneon echoing in a plaza. It is undeniably intoxicating for a visitor.
It really is.
But, and this is where I want to push back a little, we need to critically examine the danger here.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, if a nation relies this heavily on the emotional resonance of beef, football, and street bands to brand itself globally, doesn't it risk catastrophic commodification?
Ah, I see what you're saying.
Like there is a real danger of flattening a highly complex, historically intellectual society into a simplified, easily digestible stereotype. You end up as a caricature.
The passionate, slightly chaotic nation of meat and soccer.
Exactly. Doesn't that hurt their legitimacy?
The author actually acknowledges that risk as a central vulnerability of cultural diplomacy.
Right.
When complex cultural expressions are packaged for mass global consumption, they are frequently stripped of their historical nuance.
It becomes a theme park version of itself.
Exactly. Take the tango, for instance.
Mhm.
Today, it is often marketed globally as this sleek, romantic ballroom dance.
You see it on dancing competition shows all the time.
Right. But its origins are in the working class, immigrant tenements of Buenos Aires in the late 19th century.
It was gritty.
Very. It was born from urban struggle, male marginalization, and longing. And over the decades, it also served as a vehicle for political dissent and social commentary.
So it's heavily layered.
Yes, if the state merely promotes tango as a shiny tourist attraction, it loses its authenticity.
And soft power fundamentally requires authenticity to generate legitimacy.
Exactly. If foreign audiences sense they are being sold a sanitized, hollowed-out stereotype, the conversion chain breaks down immediately.
So it is an incredibly delicate tightrope walk. A nation has to use the visceral, emotional hooks of sports and food to grab the world's attention.
Right, to get them in the door.
But before the audience reduces them to a stereotype, they have to pivot and demonstrate profound depth.
Which brings us to a fascinating revelation in the text.
Yes, the secondary layer.
Right. While the world is distracted by the immediate passions of the World Cup and the asado, Argentina has spent the last century cultivating a much slower, highly intellectual form of global influence.
We are talking about the country's public education system.
Yes, education is the slow-building anchor that counterbalances the immediate emotional hooks of the culture.
Right.
The book explores the historical trajectory of Argentina's public university system, focusing heavily on institutions like the University of Buenos Aires, UBA, which was founded in 1821.
It's math.
Huge. But the pivotal moment in this timeline, and arguably one of the most consequential intellectual exports in Latin American history, was the 1918 university reform.
The 1918 reform, which started in the central city of Cordoba,
Exactly.
it completely rewired how higher education functioned. Because prior to this, universities in the region were largely elitist, clerical, and totally disconnected from the rapidly changing social realities of the early 20th century.
They were very archaic.
Right. So the students in Cordoba rebelled. They demanded academic freedom, secular curriculums, and crucially, student participation in university governance.
They wanted a seat at the table.
They wanted a system that was free, pluralistic, and open to the working and middle classes.
And the shock waves of the Cordoba reform did not stop at the national borders.
Right, it spread everywhere.
The manifesto drafted by those students radiated across Latin America, inspiring massive educational overhauls in Peru, Cuba, Mexico, and Chile.
It positioned Argentina not just as a cultural hub, but as the vanguard of progressive, democratic intellectualism in the Spanish-speaking world.
Verne categorizes this legacy as a form of latent soft power.
Latent. I like that.
Because the return on investment for a diplomatic strategy based on education is drastically different from the immediate viral spike of winning a sporting event.
Right. Winning the World Cup gives you power overnight. The ROI on a university system takes decades to materialize.
It is the ultimate long game.
Because these public universities remain tuition-free and maintain a policy of relatively open access, they have historically welcomed thousands upon thousands of international students.
Yes, and these aren't just students from neighboring countries. They come from across Latin America, from various African nations, and increasingly from Europe.
Seeking out this highly politicized, rigorous academic environment.
By subsidizing the education of these foreign nationals, Argentina is quietly mass-producing lifelong ambassadors.
Think about the life cycle of one of these students, They
Yeah.
leave their home country at 18 or 19.
Very formative years.
Exactly. They spend 5 to 10 of their most formative years in Buenos Aires or Cordoba. They integrate into the society.
They drink the mate, they attend the asados.
They participate in the legendary, intense political debates in the university hallways.
And when they eventually return to their home countries, they do so as fully qualified doctors, lawyers, engineers.
And, crucially, policymakers and diplomats.
Right. The book refers to the networks formed by these alumni as soft corridors of influence.
So imagine a scenario where a former public university student from Colombia or Senegal eventually becomes the Minister of Health or a senior trade negotiator for their home government.
Right.
When that individual sits across the table from Argentine representatives, their baseline perspective is fundamentally altered by their lived experience.
We aren't strangers.
Exactly. Their deep-seated respect for the intellectual rigor they experience and the emotional bonds they formed during their youth injects a layer of goodwill into state-to-state relations that no traditional lobbying effort could ever purchase.
It's deeply ingrained. This prestige permeates international borders silently, establishing a baseline of empathy.
That structural empathy is a brilliant diplomatic asset, but we cannot ignore the physical reality of these institutions today.
Right, we have to talk about the chainsaw again.
Exactly. The book is very transparent about the severe crises facing the university system. If we return to the concept of the institutional chainsaw, the public education sector has not been spared.
Not at all.
So how does a country maintain this aura of outsized intellectual prestige while simultaneously dealing with documented massive budget constraints
And decaying physical infrastructure.
and the constant threat of strikes due to evaporating academic salaries? It is akin to having a Nobel laureate professor attempting to deliver a groundbreaking lecture in a classroom where the roof is literally leaking and the electricity keeps cutting out.
A crumbling classroom analogy.
Right. Does the sheer brilliance of the ideas generated in that space eventually get overshadowed by the lack of material resources?
The fragility of this intellectual prestige is definitely the most precarious aspect of their long-term strategy. The book acknowledges that universities have endured profound suffering.
Not just recently, right?
Right, not just from recent underfunding, but from historical periods of severe political interference and authoritarian censorship.
So how does the prestige survive that?
Well, the prestige has proven remarkably resilient because the global reputation of these institutions is deeply intertwined with the historical ecosystem of intellectual giants they helped foster.
The literature.
Yes. The brand of Argentine academia is intrinsically linked to literary titans like Jorge Luis Borges, Julio Cortázar, Silvina Ocampo, and countless globally recognized sociologists and scientists.
So when a foreign reader navigates Borges' philosophical labyrinths or reads Cortázar's structural experimentation, they aren't just consuming fiction.
No, they are absorbing a brand identity.
The literature successfully marketed Argentina to the world as a geography of profound intellectual sophistication.
Precisely. That intellectual production operated in perfect symbiosis with the city's vibrant cafe culture, its massive independent publishing industry, and its academic hubs.
So it's a whole package.
Yes. Consequently, when a modern international student arrives in Buenos Aires, they are not expecting the manicured lawns and heavily funded corporate laboratories of an Ivy League campus.
They know what they are signing up for.
Exactly. They are migrating specifically to immerse themselves in that rigorous, slightly chaotic, historically rich tradition of pluralistic debate.
So the brilliance of the professor has, historically, compensated for the crumbling classroom.
It has. However, Verne offers a stark warning here.
Okay.
Relying indefinitely on the fumes of historical legacy without executing concrete investments in modern infrastructure and research capabilities is a highly unsustainable geopolitical strategy.
The reality will eventually catch up.
Yes. The latent soft power will eventually evaporate if the material reality continues to degrade.
So if we synthesize what we've covered so far, we see a country wielding a highly sophisticated two-pronged diplomatic toolkit.
Right.
You have the rapid emotional resonance generated by cultural exports like sports, food, and music, working in tandem with the deep, slow-burning structural influence of educational prestige.
It's a powerful combination.
The critical question then becomes, how is this specific combination of tools deployed in the highest stakes arenas of global geopolitics?
When it really matters.
Right. How does a nation use culture and academia when it faces a seemingly insurmountable hard power conflict?
And that inquiry leads directly to the most analytically rigorous section of Verne's text, the examination of the Malvinas or Falklands sovereignty dispute.
Okay, before we unpack this chapter, we need to establish a very clear boundary for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
As Strategic Labs, we are strictly examining the diplomatic strategies, the narrative architecture, and the theoretical frameworks detailed in Matthias Verne's book. We are treating this as an academic case study in the application of public diplomacy.
Right. We are absolutely not taking a geopolitical side, nor are we endorsing any specific claims regarding the sovereignty of the islands.
We are analyzing the machinery of the narrative, nothing else.
And that neutrality is essential because the author himself frames the Malvinas conflict specifically as a theoretical laboratory for soft power.
Why does he call it a laboratory?
Because in this particular territorial dispute, the utilization of hard power by Argentina is functionally impossible.
Right, the mismatch is too huge.
Exactly. The geopolitical asymmetry between a developing South American nation and the United Kingdom, which is a nuclear-armed permanent member of the UN Security Council with full NATO backing, is absolute.
It's night and day.
When military coercion's off the table and economic sanctions are unfeasible, a state has no choice but to rely entirely on its soft power apparatus to keep its strategic objectives alive on the international stage.
So how do you fight a geopolitical battle without weapons or trade embargoes?
Well, Verne details how the state apparatus pivots away from traditional adversarial posturing.
Right, because yelling about it legally doesn't always work.
Exactly. Instead of merely reciting legal doctrines regarding territorial integrity or standard UN decolonization frameworks, arguments that honestly often fail to engage the broader global public, they deploy the cultural storefront.
They bring the culture to the front line.
They attempt to frame their sovereignty claim through deeply moral, historical, and emotional narratives.
How exactly? Give me an example.
The strategy involves organizing extensive cultural exhibitions in foreign capitals, funding academic symposiums, and establishing joint research initiatives that focus on the geography and history of the South Atlantic.
So they make it an academic and cultural discussion rather than a military one?
The methodology is deeply strategic. Traditional political posturing usually hardens the opposition. It creates immediate defensive walls.
Right, you get defensive when someone demands something.
Exactly. By routing the conversation through the realms of culture and academia, they bypass those rigid diplomatic barriers.
That makes sense. When a state hosts international scholars to debate the historical nuances of 19th century maritime law, or screens documentary films that highlight the human and ecological dimensions of the South Atlantic, they're actively humanizing an abstract geopolitical dispute.
They give it a face.
Right. The ultimate goal is to foster a baseline of dialogue and empathy among global audiences who would otherwise be completely indifferent to a territorial conflict occurring thousands of miles away.
And let's follow the logic of the soft corridors we discussed earlier.
The international students.
Right. When an international student from, say, a developing nation in Africa or the Middle East graduates from the University of Buenos Aires and eventually joins their home country's diplomatic corps, they eventually find themselves at the United Nations General Assembly.
Right.
When a resolution regarding the Malvinas dispute is brought to the floor, that diplomat's vote is not cast in a vacuum.
It's quietly influenced by the years of cultural immersion.
Exactly. The academic framing they were exposed to and the emotional bonds they formed with the Argentine narrative.
That is a conversion chain attempting to bridge the gap from cultural affection to actual diplomatic leverage.
Right.
But we have to look critically at the efficacy of this.
Okay.
Can the projection of soft power, no matter how brilliant the art, how rigorous the academia, or how compelling the historical narrative, actually move the needle against the hard power realities of entrenched global alliances?
It's a tough question.
I mean, is this elaborate cultural diplomacy actually a mechanism for geopolitical change? Or is it fundamentally a coping mechanism?
A coping mechanism, that's a strong way to put it.
Well, is it just a highly sophisticated way to preserve national dignity, to avoid admitting defeat, and to keep the conversation artificially alive on the global stage, knowing full well it will never alter the physical reality on the ground?
That is the exact limitation of soft power that the author grapples with in the text. Soft power is a subtle tool. It is not magic.
It doesn't win wars.
It cannot spontaneously rewrite entrenched geopolitical realities, nor can it overcome massive disparities in military and economic force.
So what is the conclusion?
Verne concludes that in the specific context of the Malvinas, the soft power apparatus functions primarily to maintain visibility and sustain international legitimacy.
It prevents the sovereignty claim from fading into historical obscurity.
Exactly. By continuously engaging the global community through cultural and academic channels, the state successfully builds a reservoir of international goodwill and sympathy, particularly within the bloc of Latin American nations and the broader global South.
And that sympathy provides crucial diplomatic leverage in multilateral forums.
Yes. So while the cultural strategy may not move the needle in terms of an immediate transfer of territorial administration, it successfully preserves the vitality of the claim.
It forces the international community and the opposing party to continuously engage with the narrative rather than declaring the issue permanently closed.
Exactly. It keeps the file open on the desk.
Historically, building that kind of narrative required an immense amount of patience.
Decades of work.
Constructing a reservoir of global goodwill took decades of slow, deliberate work in diplomatic halls. It required literature to be slowly translated and disseminated.
It required international students to spend years studying and then return home to climb the ranks of their respective governments.
But the timeline for narrative building has fundamentally collapsed.
Completely.
The battle for global empathy and cultural visibility is no longer fought over decades in universities. It is fought instantaneously, in real time, on the screens we carry in our pockets.
And this brings us to the final and perhaps most volatile theme of Verne's analysis.
The collision of Argentina's traditional soft power with the modern digital ecosystem.
The digital age has entirely rewired the circuitry of international influence.
Yeah.
The speed and scale at which soft power operates have accelerated exponentially. The book devotes its final chapters to examining how platforms driven by short-form video algorithms, TikTok, Instagram Reels, Twitter, have viralized Argentine culture.
Transforming localized, intimate practices into massive, global, micro-narratives.
Micro-narratives, exactly.
What we are witnessing is the absolute democratization of diplomacy.
Oh, yes.
In the 20th century, if a state wanted to project a specific image abroad, an ambassador or a state-funded cultural institute carefully curated an exhibition or a publication, the state held a monopoly on its own narrative.
They controlled the spigot.
Right. Today, the state has lost that control. Every single tourist who lands at the airport with a smartphone is an unofficial, highly influential ambassador.
Whether they know it or not.
Exactly. If a visitor films a 15-second aesthetic video of themselves trying mate for the first time at a sunlit park, or records the melancholic beauty of a street tango in the San Telmo neighborhood,
the algorithm can push that micro-narrative to 10 million global screens within 24 hours.
it's wild. A beautifully lit, high-definition video of a sizzling asado can generate more immediate international attraction in a single day than a traditional embassy initiative could achieve in a year.
The reach is unprecedented. The reach is indeed phenomenal, but Verne is quick to caution that the digital sphere is a profound, incredibly dangerous double-edged sword for a country with institutional instability.
Because it exposes everything.
Yes. The digital ecosystem amplifies the aesthetic warmth and cultural appeal at unprecedented speeds. But it simultaneously, and just as ruthlessly, exposes the country's institutional fractures.
The algorithm doesn't care about the state's narrative goals.
Not at all. The underlying logic of social media algorithms does not prioritize nuance, historical context, or state objectives. The algorithms prioritize engagement, which is most often driven by sensationalism, conflict, and aesthetic beauty.
And this is exactly where the cognitive dissonance we discussed at the very beginning of this analysis hits the global observer with maximum force.
It's the storefront and the kitchen, all on your phone.
Exactly. Imagine the experience of an average user scrolling through their feed. They swipe up and watch a cinematic, highly romanticized video of a family laughing and sharing wine around a beautifully smoky asado.
It is a pure, concentrated dose of cultural warmth and soft power.
Right. But when they swipe up to the very next video on their timeline, the algorithm serves them chaotic, raw, user-generated footage of thousands of people protesting in the streets of Buenos Aires over sudden currency devaluations.
The timeline flattens reality.
The beautiful storefront and the kitchen engulfed in flames are broadcast to the world simultaneously, side by side, in high definition.
And that instantaneous juxtaposition creates deep confusion and immediate hesitation for the global observer.
It gives them whiplash.
It does. Soft power at its foundation relies on credibility and trust. If a nation's digital narrative is violently oscillating day by day between romanticized cultural perfection and stark institutional collapse,
It becomes exceptionally difficult to build long-term trust with international investors, diplomatic partners, or potential expatriates.
furthermore, the viral fame generated by these platforms is inherently ephemeral.
It doesn't last.
The algorithmic life cycle of a trend decays rapidly. A cultural practice might capture global attention for a week, only to be entirely forgotten by the time the next trend surfaces.
Attempting to manage a state's strategic reputation in this environment seems practically impossible.
It really is a nightmare for a traditional diplomat.
It is like trying to conduct a massive, complex symphony. But every single person in the audience has brought their own loud instrument. They're all playing from different sheet music, and the conductor's baton has been replaced by a completely opaque algorithm.
Great analogy.
How can a state possibly navigate a narrative that is entirely decentralized and prone to such rapid, unpredictable decay?
Verne argues that a state cannot control the digital narrative, nor should it attempt to do so in a democratic society.
Right, because censorship backfires anyway.
Exactly. The government cannot and must not stop citizens from uploading protest videos or economic critiques.
So what is the strategy then?
The only viable public diplomacy strategy in the modern era is one anchored in absolute authenticity and institutional coherence.
So you have to actually fix the kitchen.
Yes. The state must be mature enough to acknowledge its own complexities. If a government attempts to pump out sanitized, highly produced propaganda highlighting only the positive cultural aspects, the decentralized internet will immediately debunk it and mock it.
Destroying whatever legitimacy remained.
Precisely. The strategy must involve genuine engagement. It means fostering deep academic and cultural exchanges that provide the vital historical context missing from a 15-second video.
Right.
But above all, Verne concludes that the only true way to navigate the digital exposure is to fundamentally improve the institutional realities on the ground. Because in the era of decentralized digital broadcasting, you cannot hide the kitchen.
You really can't hide the kitchen anymore. The digital window is simply too massive and too transparent.
It really is.
And that realization brings us perfectly full circle. This deep dive into the invisible power of Argentina has illuminated a profound geopolitical reality.
Yes, it has.
A brilliant cultural storefront. The gleaming World Cup trophies, the passionate history of the tango, the intellectual weight of Borges's literature, the communal warmth of the asado, and the long-game diplomacy of public universities. It is undeniably magnetic.
It is incredibly powerful.
It possesses the sheer gravitational pull to draw the attention of the entire world to your door. But true, lasting strategic influence, the kind that translates into robust economies and ironclad diplomatic alliances, requires the kitchen to be in order.
It requires the seamless alignment of authentic cultural expression with uncompromising institutional integrity.
That is the ultimate enduring lesson of the Argentine paradox. Soft power is an incredibly potent multiplier, but at the end of the day, it can only multiply the reality of the institutions you have built.
Right, because if the foundation is unstable, the cultural influence remains an aesthetic trapped behind glass.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to evaluate on your own.
We challenge you to look closely at your own nation's soft power strategy.
Think about the specific image, the cultural exports, and the narratives your country projects to the global public. Does your country rely on a shiny, highly curated, algorithm-friendly cultural storefront to mask deep structural cracks in its societal foundation?
Or do your domestic institutions, your rule of law, your economic predictability, your civic infrastructure actually match the cultural hype you export to the world?
Because as we've learned today, in the hyper-connected 21st century, true, enduring global influence demands that the back of the house is just as solid, just as reliable as the beautiful display in the window. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember, the link to buy The Invisible Power of Argentina is in the description. See you in the next analysis.